The Honourable Member for Abitibi Bay James Invict Inu.
Miigwech jigani ganskmenu abseatuda. Tinskumden abetsin jaji yemian jidbaj muyagetni. Nskamaun gani ganskakut Canada. Kayamuda kinyojoyo kabetsnakuda. Nasabugen skama kawichigodnyo wichagan degat dechaga kabedo. Nskamaut nistamt abetsin koyo iuichtun iu debatmun iu yimunge. Tinskumden mag abetsnin jidipsuguyan mimbego. Mr. Speaker, I want to start by honoring the memory of late Colton Bushing, because this tragedy, I lost sleep over it since it happened, is an equally tragic reminder of where things are in this country that you call Canada. The underlying discrimination, denial of rights, and impoverishment are pervasive in this country for Indigenous peoples, like for Indigenous peoples all over the world. The discrimination and other human rights violations that Indigenous peoples face or encounter throughout Canada are at crisis levels. It's as simple as that. Indigenous peoples, families, youth, women, children, all are impacted with ongoing devastating effects. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples must be the framework for reconciliation, Mr. Speaker, and to ensure that the present and future generations of Indigenous peoples and individuals will be treated equally to other peoples while recognizing our right to be different and respected as such. Mr. Speaker, self-determination is not just a word. Self-determination is the most basic human right that belongs to Indigenous peoples as well, without which, may I add, without which other human rights cannot be fully enjoyed by Indigenous peoples. There is hope from the words that were pronounced by the Prime Minister, and I thanked him in Cree for those words. While I appreciate the Prime Minister's words today, we need to make sure that this time it is for real. One of the most unacceptable things politicians can do is to eventually quash that hope of the most vulnerable in our society. Mr. Speaker, by breaking yet another promise. That cannot happen. I will not let that happen again. We've known that for 150 years. We've faced that for 150 years, broken promises. Well, guess what, Mr. Speaker? We will not let that happen again for the next 150 years. Mr. Speaker, everybody's friend, internationally Desmond Tutu, once said, hope is being able to see that there is light despite all the darkness. End of quote. Mr. Speaker, The rising tide of anger, I think, are the words of the Prime Minister. The rising tide of anger that we feel in this country at the moment will reach further heights if he doesn't deliver on his commitments of today. Because remember, we all know that there's another case coming down for ruling, Tina Fontaine. So I'm afraid, I'm frightened by the prospect, the outcome, if it's a negative outcome for Indigenous peoples again. I'm frightened by that moment coming up. So we need to make sure that we deliver on our promises. We need to go from words to action now. I've heard the same words from the mouth of the Prime Minister during the last federal election campaign. I've heard the same words from the Prime Minister after his election. I've heard the same words from the Prime Minister when he spoke in December 2015 after his election to the Assembly of First Nations. He talked about the United Nations Declaration. He talked about delivering on that promise. So let's make sure it happens for real this time. Mr. Speaker, there are many files and issues that we can fix right now, that we could have fixed 2 years ago when they got elected, because they got elected on those promises. But yet, Indigenous peoples in this country continue to face discrimination and injustice. And you cannot claim that you're upholding the honor of the Crown if you continue to not respect the human rights of Indigenous peoples in this country. The denial of Indigenous peoples' rights continued under this government, Mr. Speaker, despite their promise for real change. I remember those promises. I was in that campaign as well. Need I to remind you of the resistance that this government had to the ruling of the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal. It took 4 compliance orders following the ruling of the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal. There's definitely a lack of access, to give another example, in the fishing rights that he raised, in the fishing rights of my brothers and sisters in the Neutral Territory on the west coast of British Columbia, in spite of the fact that they won their court case 10 years ago. 10 years ago. And this government, or the governments, have spent millions of dollars on fighting this case over the years. Indigenous women and girls continue to go missing or get murdered. Our youth continue to take their own lives. Free, prior, informed consent is not being used in major projects. Site C, Kinder Morgan, Muskrat Falls. In fact, we're even threatened by the Natural Resource Minister if we do dare to oppose these projects. Mr. Speaker, I can go on and on with that list of things that we can fix right away. And it's possible. The frameworks are there. So let's start going beyond the MOUs and the framework agreements, the engagement sessions, and all of these, the litany of expressions that they have been using. I've negotiated for 30 years with governments, third parties, Mr. Speaker, and in our jargon, we call that delay tactics. We call that a policy of, we'll do it, but eventually. Mr. Speaker, I believe in reconciliation. I believe in justice for Indigenous peoples. I think we all can agree to those concepts in this country now. And since the report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and there are major recommendations contained in that report that we should all endorse right now. So when I say that there are already frameworks in this country, I'm talking about those Section 35 Aboriginal and treaty rights. I'm talking about the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. I'm also talking about our treaties. I'm talking about our international obligations as a member state of the United Nations organization. And we're signatories to major conventions in that regard, Mr. Speaker. The two international human rights covenants speak to the right of self-determination of Indigenous peoples. That's another framework. Another framework, to give you an example. Before the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was established, the Supreme Court of this country, the highest court of this land, talked about reconciliation. And in doing so, the Supreme Court said, and I quote, "The objective is to reconcile the pre-existing sovereignty of Indigenous peoples with the assumed sovereignty of the Crown." Let me repeat that for you, Mr. Speaker. The Supreme Court said, when talking about reconciliation in the 2004 Haida Nation case, the objective is to reconcile the pre-existing sovereignty of Indigenous peoples with the assumed sovereignty of the Crown. Assumed. Not my word, the Supreme Court, Mr. Speaker. So in the spirit of reconciliation, and in the spirit also of collaboration with the government in front of us, I want to propose a couple of suggestions for the work ahead of us. You know, Mr. Speaker, I've always offered my support and collaboration with any party in power, and I continue to do so to this day, especially with regards to the human rights of the First Peoples of this country. So, Mr. Speaker, I think the framework should contain several elements, and key elements, I would add. First, Indigenous peoples' rights are human rights. Let's start talking that language in this place and in this country. The human rights of Indigenous peoples have been treated as human rights for 3 decades now within the United Nations system. I think we should start doing that today in this country. International human rights standards need to be followed, and not just those that are contained in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Third, we need special measures. In view of the ongoing impacts of colonization, we cannot deny that, discrimination, land and resource dispossession, and marginalization, the disadvantages of Indigenous peoples are exacerbated. Let's recognize that as well. So therefore, there special measures are required for a wide range of matters. This would include safeguarding of cultures, languages, land and resource rights of Indigenous peoples. Fourth, equality and non-discrimination. As affirmed in the preamble of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and I quote, "Indigenous peoples are equal to all other peoples, while recognizing the right of all peoples to be different, to consider themselves different, and to be respected as such." That's a direct quote from the preamble of the UN Declaration. The Prime Minister has often said that cultural diversity in this country is important to him. Well, there's yet another opportunity to maintain, protect, and promote the Indigenous languages in this country, and we need to do that collaboratively. Again, as a Cree language speaker, I can assist the Prime Minister in this endeavor. Fifth, repudiation of the doctrine of superiority. Both the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination and the UN Declaration condemn these doctrines as invalid and scientifically false. Six, consultation and cooperation, of course, and the Prime Minister did mention that. Seventh, the free, prior, and informed consent concept needs to be acknowledged, endorsed, and embraced in this country. In many cases, after full and fair consideration of the rights of all those involved, the free, prior, and informed consent of Indigenous peoples must prevail. Eighth, environment and development. And this is another important aspect, Mr. Speaker. In order to achieve sustainable and equitable development from an Indigenous perspective, environmental protection must constitute an integral part of the development process and it cannot be considered in isolation from it. Ninth, legislative and other measures. Again, the Prime Minister talked about that today, and again, I thank him for that. I think we need to do that in order to move forward as a nation. 10, a human rights-based approach. The UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Peoples underlined at the international, regional, and national levels the human rights of Indigenous peoples are always relevant if such rights are at risk of being undermined. Let's recall that again. There needs to be some form of restitution of lands and territories. That is also in the UN Declaration, and it is also said that when it's not possible, just, fair, and equitable compensation needs to happen for Indigenous peoples. And finally, Mr. Speaker, revitalization of Indigenous languages and cultures. The UN Declaration Articles 11 and 214, affirms that Indigenous peoples have the right to revitalize their languages and cultures, and states have obligations to take effective measures in this regard. Such actions serve to reinforce Indigenous peoples to live in peace and security as distinct peoples. All peoples, including Indigenous peoples, contribute to the diversity and richness of civilizations and cultures around the world. Mr. Speaker, nui wichtmo minbego, ju wichtmaden geti minbego. Nastawa się shanga but snieg. Jiji yamud manu yocho kapat snmani. Suggesting as behta gwiat the dating. Chedon jipastenan and the bajmunan. Chedoge jipastenan and datamunan nian inuch would Canada with yat. Chedoge and Gugwejmauj, Jujamakans. Wichinan, Juijot no. The seven Muhtagan, a donut, Nuijawagan. Egun Jaitik. Egun could start out Jaitik, then he stamps. But still, Nuitamodins, Abadonda, a gamts, Nuitamods. Udete being Nigia. Muk Nuitamods, Gjiwich house, Gjiwich Gabu stoach, then he stamps. A good staple to go, Jaitik. Very briefly, Mr. Speaker, those concluding remarks were words of thanks and gratitude for me to be able to stand in this place as a person that was born literally on the land under a tent some 50 and more years ago, and now being able to speak to you in this House and to the Prime Minister. I'm very grateful for that. It's been a long journey, and I offered my collaboration to the government to achieve those commitments that were expressed by the Prime Minister. One of the most beautiful words in Cree is Nui Jawagan. Nui Jawagan means he or she that walks by my side. So I offer my friendship to all of us. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.